At about 7:30 on the evening of the 18th of November, 1987, a single lit match slipped through the side of a wooden escalator at King's Cross Station and vanished into the darkness beneath the moving stairs. Nobody saw it fall. Nobody could have known that in the running track below, those wooden steps lay decades of accumulated grease, fibre, dust, ticket fragments, and the ordinary filth of the busiest railway junction in Britain. The match landed in all of it, and it began, very quietly, to burn. 15 minutes later, 31 people were dead. They were commuters, most of them. People heading home on a cold Wednesday evening. People changing trains. People climbing the last escalator toward the mainline platforms and the buses on the Euston Road above. They had done nothing wrong. They had bought a ticket and stepped onto a moving staircase, the same act performed millions of times a day across London, without a second thought. None of them knew they were standing inside a machine that had been quietly cataloguing its own danger for nearly 30 years, and that the people responsible for their safety had decided as a matter of settled policy that fires like this were simply inevitable and not worth the alarm. There was no war. There was no bomb, though in the London of 1987 many first assumed there must be. There was no earthquake, no collapse, no act of God. There was only a discarded match, a bed of grease that should never have been allowed to gather, a phenomenon of fire that science had not yet given a name, and an organisation so accustomed to small fires that it had stopped being afraid of them. What happened at King's Cross that night would rewrite the physics of how fire behaves on a slope. It would force a public inquiry that sat for 91 days and delivered 157 recommendations. It would tear out the wooden escalators of the London Underground, close a gap in the law that had left subsurface stations dangerously unregulated, and change the way fire itself is taught in schools of engineering around the world. Every metal, sprinklered, smoke-free escalator you ride beneath a British city today exists because of what happened in the ticket hall at King's Cross. But before any of that, there were the people. A fire officer who went down into the smoke and did not come back up. A quiet Scottish man whom the fire would take, and who would then lie without a name for 16 years. And an ordinary evening rush hour that turned in the space of a few minutes into the worst disaster in the history of the London Underground. This is how it happened, and this is why it did not have to. If you find yourself moved by the people in this story, stay with them to the end, because the last of them does not get his name back until the very last part of it. To understand what was lost that night, you have to understand what King's Cross was. Not the tragedy, but the place on any ordinary day. By 1987, King's Cross St Pancras was one of the great crossroads of London, and had been for well over a century. Above ground stood two of the capital's mighty Victorian termini, side by side on the Euston Road. King's Cross Station itself, with its plain twin arches of yellow brick, had opened in 1852, sending trains north to Peterborough, York, Newcastle, and on into Scotland. Beside it rose the extravagant red brick Gothic of St Pancras, its Midland Grand Hotel frontage, a cathedral to the railway age. Between and beneath them ran one of the densest junctions on the entire London Underground. Down in the tunnels, 6 lines converged. The Piccadilly, the Victoria, the Northern, the Circle, the Metropolitan, and the Hammersmith and City all passed through King's Cross, St Pancras threading commuters from the suburbs and the shires into the heart of the city and out again. At the evening peak, tens of thousands of people moved through that interchange every hour. They came up from the deep Piccadilly and Victoria platforms on long escalators, crossed the ticket hall, and passed out into the night, toward the mainline concourses, the buses, and the streets of Camden and Islington, and beyond. It was, in the texture of its ordinariness, a very particular kind of place, and a very particular moment in the life of London. This was the Underground of the 1980s. The trains wore the old cream and red livery. The platforms carried enamel signs and dot matrix indicators. The seats were upholstered in patterned moquette, and the tunnels were stained dark by generations of steam and smoke and grime. And the escalators in many of the older parts of the network were made substantially of wood. Wooden treads, wooden skirting boards, wooden balustrades, some of them dating in parts to the 1930s. They creaked and clattered under the weight of the crowds, and they had done so, faithfully, for decades. The system was run by London Underground Limited, which answered to London Regional Transport, the statutory body responsible for public transport in the capital. And the London Underground of the 1980s was, above all, a network under strain. It was old. Parts of it were the oldest of their kind anywhere in the world, the first deep tube lines having opened before the turn of the century. It was chronically underinvested, its budget squeezed year after year, its infrastructure aging faster than it could be renewed. Maintenance was deferred. Cleaning, in the hidden spaces where the public never looked, was not what it should have been. And within that institution, over many years, a very dangerous belief had taken root. The London Underground had never, in its entire history, suffered a fatal fire underground. Not once. From the earliest days of the deep tubes, through 2 world wars, through the Blitz when the platform sheltered thousands from the bombs, above, no passenger had ever died in a fire beneath the streets. That was a remarkable record, and it should have been a source of vigilance. Instead, it became a source of complacency. If it had never happened, the reasoning went, then perhaps it could not really happen. Perhaps the danger was not as real as the theory suggested. That belief was written, in effect, into the rule book. Staff were instructed to deal with small fires themselves, and to call the London Fire Brigade only when a fire was, in the phrase that would later be turned over and over in the inquiry, beyond their control. The default was to manage the problem in-house, to avoid the disruption and the embarrassment of calling out the brigade to keep the trains running. Summoning professional firefighters was treated not as the first response to a fire, but as a last resort. To understand how that belief survived, you have to know how often small fires actually happened, and what the organisation had decided to call them. Between 1958 and 1987, on the escalators of the London Underground alone, there were recorded somewhere in the region of 400 fires. 400. Small outbreaks, most of them, in the machinery and the running tracks beneath the moving stairs, where grease and fluff and rubbish gathered. And the organisation had a word for them. It did not call them fires, it called them smoulderings. It is a small word and a revealing one. To call a fire a smouldering is to decide in advance that it is not serious. It is to file the thing away as routine, as maintenance, as an untidiness to be swept up rather than a warning to be heeded. 400 times, over nearly 30 years, fire had broken out in the escalators of the Underground, and 400 times the organisation had, in effect, shrugged. None of them had killed anyone. That was taken as proof that none of them could. When Sir Desmond Fennell later came to examine all of this, he chose his words with the precision of a barrister. The possibility of a serious escalator fire, he found, had been a blind spot in the organisation. Management, he concluded, had come to regard fires on the oldest and largest underground system in the world as, in a word, inevitable. It was a view he judged to be fundamentally in error. Fires were not inevitable, they were preventable. But you cannot prevent a danger you have decided not to see. And there had been warnings, not vague general warnings, but specific ones in writing, from the people whose job it was to know. The London Fire Brigade had, roughly a month before the King's Cross fire, put its concerns about the risk of fire at underground stations into writing. The brigade understood, as fire professionals, what an accumulation of combustible material in a confined space with a single point of ignition could do. Internal accident inquiries within London Underground itself had, over the years, generated recommendations about fire safety. But Fennell found that these warnings and recommendations either did not reach the right people or were not acted on. They went up into the organisation and disappeared. The knowledge existed. It simply did not travel to the places where decisions were made, or if it did not move anyone to act. There was even equipment. Beneath some of the escalators, water fog spray systems had been installed, designed precisely to suppress a fire in the running track before it could spread. On the night of the 18th of November, that equipment was not used. The staff on duty had not been trained to use it, or were not confident enough in it to try. The tools to fight the fire in its infancy were physically present, feet away, and they sat idle because the people beside them did not know how, or did not think to, or had never been drilled to reach for them. Fire training and evacuation training for station staff was, the inquiry found, minimal to non-existent. People whose workplace was a deep network of tunnels through which 100,000 strangers passed each day had, many of them, never been properly taught what to do if that network caught fire. And above all of it sat a gap in the law itself. The fire safety regimes that governed cinemas and theatres and other public buildings, the regimes that required inspections and certificates and enforceable standards, did not fully extend to subsurface railway stations. The underground existed in a regulatory blind spot to match its cultural one. Its safety practices were overseen largely from within, by the same organisation that ran the trains and balanced the books, with little independent external scrutiny of the kind that might have forced the hidden dangers into the light. Nobody with the power to compel change was looking closely enough. So this was the machine, and this was the mind that ran it. An ageing network of wooden escalators standing over deep tunnels. Decades of grease and fluff accumulating in the running tracks. 400 small fires reclassified as smoulderings. A rule book that discouraged calling the fire brigade. Warnings that vanished on their way up the chain. Suppression equipment nobody used. Staff nobody had trained. And a gap in the law that meant no outside authority was forcing the issue. Every one of those failures was, on its own, survivable. Assembled together beneath a wooden escalator on a busy Wednesday evening, they were not. Two of the people who would be caught up in that failure deserved to be met before the fire as the men they were and not as the fates that awaited them. The first was Colin Townsley. He was a station officer in the London Fire Brigade, based at Soho Fire Station in the West End, one of the busiest in the country. He was an experienced man, a professional who had spent his working life running toward the fires that other people ran away from. On the night of the 18th of November, he would be the first senior brigade officer to reach King's Cross. What he did in the minutes that followed would earn him posthumously the George Medal, one of the highest awards for civilian gallantry that Britain can bestow. But that is the end of his story. For now, hold on to the simple fact of him. A fire officer, good at his job, on duty on an ordinary Wednesday, about to be sent to a station fire that must, at first, have sounded like so many others. The second man never wore a uniform and would not be remembered for what he did that night, but for the strange and painful silence that followed it. His name was Alexander Williamson Fallon. He had been born in 1914 in Falkirk in central Scotland. He was, by the time of the fire, a man of 73. He had a wife named Janet, and together they had 4 daughters. He had lived a life, but it had not been an easy one in its later years. Janet Fallon had died in December of 1974 of ovarian cancer. Her death, by every account, was the beginning of her husband's long decline. Alexander Fallon had undergone brain surgery years before and carried in his skull a particular kind of surgical clip used to treat an aneurysm of a type fitted to only a few dozen men in the whole country in that location. But it was the loss of Janet that unmoored him. In the years after her death, he drifted. By 1980, he had come south to London and had gradually slipped to the margins of the city, one of the countless people who pass through great railway stations and are barely seen. His 4 daughters lost touch with him. He became, in the phrase the world would later use of him without knowing his name, a man who had drifted out of the reach of everyone who loved him. Why Alexander Fallon was at King's Cross on the evening of the 18th of November, 1987, is not known, and it would be wrong to invent a reason. He was there. That is all that can honestly be said. He was a husband who had lost his wife, a father of 4 daughters, a Scot a long way from Falkirk, 73 years old. Remember him. His story does not end that night. In a sense, it barely begins there. Now consider the ordinary day, and the ordinary act at the centre of it. By 1987, smoking had already been banned across much of the London Underground. It had been prohibited on the trains themselves since July of 1984, and after a fire at Oxford Circus in November of that same year, a fire that sent smoke pouring through the station and put 14 people in hospital, the ban had been extended in February of 1985 to all underground stations. On paper, the entire system was smoke-free. In practice, it was nothing of the sort. The ban was poorly enforced. There were not the staff, nor the will, nor the culture to police it. And there was one particular place where it was flouted more than any other. Passengers who had endured a long journey without a cigarette would light up in the last moments before they reached the open air, on the ascending escalators as they rode up toward the exit. It was such a common sight as to be almost unremarkable. A traveller, cigarette in hand, striking a match or flicking a lighter on the moving stairs, the smoke trailing back over the shoulders of the people behind. Sometimes the spent match was dropped, still warm, into the narrow gap between the moving treads and the fixed wooden skirting at the side of the escalator. That gap led down into the running track, and in the running track lay the grease. Escalator 4 at King's Cross served the Piccadilly line. It was one of the wooden escalators, its treads and side panels made of timber that had absorbed the oils of decades of lubrication and gathered the debris of decades of crowds. Beneath the steps, in the machinery below, lay a bed of grease mixed with fibre, dust, ticket fragments, human hair, and the accumulated dirt of the busiest station on the network. It had never been thoroughly cleaned out. There was no reason, within the settled logic of the organisation, to think it needed to be. It had always been there. It had never caused a disaster. Until it did. The 18th of November was a Wednesday. It was a cold night. The evening peak filled King's Cross with the usual tide of humanity, people pressing home from work, changing between the tube and the mainline trains, climbing the escalators toward the surface. Among them, somewhere in that crowd, was Alexander Fallon. Among the crews on standby across the West End was Colin Townsley at Soho, and somewhere on escalator 4, a passenger lit a cigarette and let a match fall. At around 7:30 in the evening, passengers on escalator 4 began to notice something wrong. There were flames, small ones at first, glimpsed through the gaps in the moving wooden steps. Down in the machinery, beneath, a few people saw them and reacted the way people do, with a kind of hesitant alarm, looking for someone to tell. Word reached the station staff. It was, in those first moments, exactly the kind of incident the organisation had trained itself to regard as routine. A smouldering, something in the escalator. Nothing that had ever, in the entire history of the Underground, killed a single passenger. Staff went to investigate. At around 8:25, a police officer at the station used his radio, and the London Fire Brigade was mobilised. This was already, in the terms of the old rule book, a significant step, the summoning of outside help. At around 8:24, the first fire brigade appliances were dispatched toward King's Cross, 4 pumps and a turntable ladder, the standard response to a report of a station fire. At around 8:20, officers of the British Transport Police began to organise the evacuation of passengers. They started routing people away from the affected escalator, sending them up and out by way of the Victoria line escalators instead. The instinct was sound in one sense and catastrophic in another. The instinct was to move people upward, toward the surface, towards safety, away from the tunnels, but upward at King's Cross meant through the ticket hall, and the ticket hall sat directly at the top of escalator 4. The fire in the running track had by now been burning, quietly, and then less quietly, for some minutes. And it was doing something that no one present, and indeed no fire scientist alive, fully understood. Fire in the ordinary experience of the world rises, flames go up, heat goes up. That is the intuition every firefighter carries, and it is usually correct. But escalator 4 was not an open space, it was a trench, a long inclined channel some 30 degrees from the horizontal, walled by wooden sides running up from the depths toward the ticket hall. And in that particular geometry, the fire did not behave as fire was supposed to behave. Instead of rising vertically off the burning material, the flames lay down. They flattened along the slope of the escalator, hugging the incline, reaching up the trench rather than up into the air. As they lay flat against the wooden treads and side panels, they preheated the timber ahead of the flame front, drying it, readying it, so that the fire raced up the slope, far faster and far hotter than anyone would have predicted. Superheated gases built up in the trench and banked against the ceiling at the top. The whole escalator was becoming a furnace charging itself toward a single, violent release. And no one on the surface, no one in the ticket hall, no one directing the frightened passengers had any way of knowing what was coming, because it had never been seen before. At around 18 minutes to 8, the escalator was fully alight. The moment was almost upon them. At around 7:45 in the evening, it came. In the space of a few seconds, a jet of flame erupted from the top of escalator 4 and filled the ticket hall. It was a flashover, the sudden and near simultaneous ignition of all the superheated gas and combustible surfaces that had built to their limit in the trench below. Dense black smoke poured up behind the flame, and the ticket hall, an enclosed underground chamber with a limited number of exits, was engulfed almost instantly. A British Transport Police officer, Police Constable Stephen Hanson, was there, and later described what he saw with a plainness that no embellishment could improve. A large ball of flame, he said, which was about head height, hit the ceiling in the ticket hall. This was followed almost instantaneously by dense black smoke. That was the moment. Not a gradual spread, not a creeping fire that people could outrun, but a single, catastrophic event that turned the space from a place of alarm into a place of mortal danger between one breath and the next. People who, seconds before, had been walking toward the exits were caught with almost no warning. The formal cause of death for most of those who died that night was the effect of smoke, heat, and toxic gas inhalation in the flashover and its immediate aftermath. That is the plain fact of it, and it will be stated once and left there. 31 people did not go home. What matters now is not the manner of it, which dignity forbids dwelling on, but the scale of the response that gathered above them, and the courage of the people who went down into the smoke to try to bring the living out. Colin Townsley had reached King's Cross as the situation was escalating. As the first senior London Fire Brigade officer on the scene, the command of the incident fell to him in those critical early minutes. He went down toward the ticket hall to assess what was happening, together with a temporary sub-officer named Roger Bell from Clerkenwell. Witnesses in the chaos afterwards recalled a fire officer in a white helmet, the mark of a senior man, urging passengers to get out, moving among them and driving them toward the exits in the moments before the flashover tore through the hall. What Colin Townsley did next is the reason his name is carved into the memory of the London Fire Brigade. He was last seen going to the aid of a passenger who was in grave difficulty in the ticket hall. He did not leave. He stayed with that person when leaving was still perhaps possible for him. He was found afterwards beside that passenger near the foot of the steps that led up to the Pancras Road exit. He was the only firefighter to die at King's Cross. He was, in the years that followed, posthumously awarded the George Medal, and at Soho Fire Station, the space he had occupied was long kept in his honour. He had gone toward the fire and toward the person the fire had trapped, and he had not come back. The response that assembled above and around the station that night was enormous. As the scale of the emergency became clear, appliance after appliance was ordered to King's Cross. Ultimately, something in the order of 150 firefighters and 30 fire appliances attended, supported by 14 ambulances of the London Ambulance Service. It was one of the largest emergency responses London had seen in years, and it unfolded in appalling conditions. The heat in the ticket hall and the approaches to it was so intense that firefighters sprayed water onto one another's backs to keep working, buying themselves seconds and minutes in a place that did not want them there. Above ground, the Euston Road filled with the blue lights of the emergency services, with hoses and command vehicles, and the growing understanding among the crews that this was not a smouldering, not a routine station fire, but something without precedent. The fire was not declared out until 1:45 the following morning, the 19th of November, more than 6 hours after it had begun. Through that long night, the toll climbed. By around 10 o'clock in the evening, the Metropolitan Police were putting the number of dead at 28. It would rise. In the end, 31 people had died. Around 100 more were injured seriously enough to be taken to hospital, of whom roughly 19 were in a serious condition. Every one of the dead was an adult. There were no children among them. They were commuters and travellers, and in at least one case a fire officer who had chosen to stay. And there was one more. As the terrible work of identifying the dead went on in the days and weeks that followed, all but one of the 31 were named and returned to their families. One was not. One body could not be identified by any of the ordinary means. No family came forward to claim him. No missing person report matched. He was assigned a number in the clinical manner of such things and became known as Body 115. He would keep that number and no name for 16 years. He was, of course, Alexander Fallon, but no one yet knew it. When the shock had passed, the country demanded to know how such a thing could have happened in the heart of London in 1987. The answer came through a public inquiry, and it was one of the most thorough and consequential inquiries into a disaster that Britain had ever conducted. It was chaired by Sir Desmond Fennell, a Queen's Counsel, supported by 4 expert assessors drawn from the relevant fields of engineering and fire science. The inquiry sat from the 1st of February to the 24th of June, 1988, taking evidence across 91 days. It heard from survivors, from firefighters, from railway staff, from managers, from scientists, and it reported in November of 1988, roughly a year after the fire. The report ran to a set of conclusions and 157 recommendations, and it did not flinch. At the centre of the inquiry lay a scientific mystery that had to be solved before anything else could be understood. Why had the fire behaved as it did? Why had a fire in the machinery of an escalator of a kind that had broken out 400 times before without catastrophe suddenly produced a flashover that filled the ticket hall in seconds? The behaviour made no sense against the established understanding of how fire moved. Investigators genuinely could not at first explain it. The answer came from experiment. Scientists built scale models of the escalator and the trench it sat in, and they ran controlled fires within them. They applied the emerging techniques of computational fluid dynamics, using computers to model the movement of hot gases through the inclined channel. And to the surprise of the researchers themselves, the models reproduced the impossible behaviour. The flames really did lie flat along the slope. The fire really did preheat the surface ahead of itself and accelerate up the trench toward a violent release. The phenomenon was real, it was reproducible, and it had never been described before. It was so novel that it required a name of its own. They called it the trench effect. That single discovery is one of the reasons the King's Cross fire matters far beyond the station where it happened. A new mechanism of fire had been hiding in plain sight in the geometry of every inclined surface, and it had taken 31 deaths to reveal it. From that point on, the trench effect entered the science of fire. It changed the way fires on slopes and in channels were modelled and understood, and it passed into the codes and the teaching of fire engineering around the world. But Fennell was not content to explain the physics and stop. The physics explained how the fire spread. It did not explain why the organisation had left itself so exposed to it, why the warnings had been ignored, why the staff were untrained, why the fire brigade had not been called sooner, why the grease had been allowed to gather for decades beneath a wooden staircase. And on those questions, the inquiry was scathing. Fennell condemned the culture of London Underground in terms that left no room for evasion. He identified the blind spot. The organisation had simply not seen the possibility of a serious escalator fire, despite 400 warnings written in smoke over 30 years. He condemned the belief that fires were inevitable on the oldest and largest underground system in the world, calling that view fundamentally in error, because it had converted a preventable danger into an accepted cost of doing business. He condemned the smoulderings mindset that had systematically minimised those 400 fires and stripped them of their power to warn. He condemned the rule that fire brigade help should be summoned only when a fire was beyond the control of staff, a rule that built delay into the very first response to danger. He condemned the failures of training, the failures of communication, the equipment that sat unused because no one knew how to use it. And he did something else, something that marks the inquiry as a work of moral as well as technical intelligence. He was careful to direct the blame away from the frontline staff and toward the management and the systems above them. The men and women on the platforms and in the ticket hall that night had done what they had been trained or not trained to do. They had been failed by an organisation that had not equipped them to meet the danger it had allowed to accumulate. The fault, Fennell made clear, lay not with the people at the bottom, but with the structure and the culture that governed them. That is the harder and the fairer conclusion, and he reached for it deliberately. No one was ever criminally prosecuted for the King's Cross fire. There was no individual whose act could be isolated and charged, no smoker ever identified, no single officer whose decision could bear the weight of 31 deaths. The failure was collective and institutional, spread across years and up and down, a chain of command, and the criminal law of the time had no ready mechanism to hold such a diffuse failure to account. Accountability, in the end, came at the level of resignation. Sir Keith Bright, the chairman of London Regional Transport, resigned in the aftermath. Dr. Tony Ridley, the chairman and managing director of London Underground, resigned as well. The men at the top of the organisation Fennell had condemned left their posts. It was not a courtroom, but it was, in its way, a reckoning. And then the story deepened in a way that turned an escalator fire into something more troubling still. In the years after the inquiry, medical and scientific analysis of the deaths raised a question about what, precisely, had killed so many of the victims. Later study attributed a large proportion of the deaths, not to burns, but to the inhalation of toxic combustion gases, and the source of some of those gases was implicated in the very fabric of the ticket hall. The paint on the ceiling, a polyurethane-based coating, was identified as a likely source of cyanide-bearing smoke when it burned. This finding comes from post-inquiry medical analysis rather than from the inquiry's own headline conclusions, and it should be held with appropriate care. But the direction of it is clear enough, and it is chilling. Many of those who died were killed not simply by fire, but by the poisonous smoke given off by the materials the station itself was made of and coated with. That is the turn that makes King's Cross more than a story about a match and some grease. It became a story about a building that turned lethal because of what it was made of and how it had been maintained. The wooden escalators provided the fuel and the fatal geometry. The uncleaned grease provided the tinder. The ceiling coatings, when the fire reached them, may have provided the poison. Every element of that chain had been chosen, or installed, or neglected by human decisions made long before anyone lit a cigarette on escalator 4. The disaster was built into the place, waiting for years. What followed the inquiry was one of the most comprehensive programs of safety reform in the history of British public transport, and it is the part of this story that reaches directly into the present day. The wooden escalators, which had provided both the fuel and the deadly trench, were condemned. A programme was begun to remove every wooden escalator from the London Underground network and replace it with metal, and although it took many years to complete, it was carried through to the end. The very last wooden escalator on the network at Greenford Station in West London continued to run until 2014, a full quarter of a century after the fire, before it too was finally retired. Today there is not a single wooden escalator left in the London Underground. That absence is a monument in itself, though almost no one riding the metal stairs today knows to read it. The law was changed to close the gap that had left subsurface stations dangerously unregulated. The Fire Precautions Subsurface Railway Stations. Regulations, made in 1989, brought underground stations within a proper framework of enforceable fire safety standards for the first time. The regulatory blind spot that had matched the cultural one was closed. Underground stations would no longer be left to police their own safety from within, unwatched by any outside authority with the power to compel change. The smoking ban, which had existed on paper and been so poorly enforced in practice, was tightened and this time made real. The prohibition was explicitly extended to the escalators, and it was extended fast. Within 5 days of the fire, on the 23rd of November 1987, smoking was banned across the whole of the Underground and enforced with a seriousness it had never been given before. The act that had almost certainly started the fire, the casual cigarette on the ascending escalator, was driven out of the system for good. Anyone old enough to remember smoking on the tube remembers a world that ended, in effect, at King's Cross. And beyond those headline measures came a thoroughgoing transformation of the way the Underground guarded against fire. Heat detectors were installed to catch fires early. Sprinkler systems were fitted beneath escalators so that a fire in the running track could be drowned before it could ever build. Staff were given better radios so that communication in an emergency would not fail. Fire training and evacuation training, which had been so shamefully lacking, were made mandatory, so that the people on duty in a station would know exactly what to do and how to do it. Hazardous paints and materials of the kind implicated in the toxic smoke were removed and replaced with safer ones. Closed-circuit television was rolled out across the network. Piece by piece, the conditions that had made King's Cross possible were dismantled. The reach of it extends far beyond London. The trench effect, discovered in the ashes of that ticket hall, became a permanent part of fire science. It is taught to fire engineers and fire investigators around the world. It changed the way inclined surfaces are understood and modelled, and it has almost certainly saved lives in places and situations that have nothing to do with railways at all. A phenomenon that cost 31 lives to reveal now protects people who will never know its name. This is the payoff of the whole terrible story, and it deserves to be said plainly. Every metal escalator on the London Underground, every sprinkler head hidden beneath the moving stairs, every no smoking sign that is actually obeyed, every trained member of station staff who knows the evacuation drill, every heat detector and every safer coating and every regulation that governs a subsurface station exists because of what happened at King's Cross on the 18th of November 1987. When you ride an escalator down into a British Underground station today, You are standing inside those reforms. You are safe in a way that the people on escalator 4 were not, and you are safe because of them. There remained at the end of all this one piece of unfinished business. One of the 31 still had no name. King's Cross St Pancras was rebuilt and transformed in the decades that followed. Its underground station vastly expanded and modernised as the mainline termini above were rebuilt for a new age of rail, for the Jubilee Line, for Thameslink, for the high-speed trains to the Channel Tunnel that now arrive at St Pancras. It is today one of the busiest interchanges in Britain, gleaming and vaulted and utterly unlike the smoke-stained station of 1987. But within it, the dead are not forgotten. A memorial plaque and a memorial clock stand in the station in honour of the 31 who died, so that the crowds who pass through in their tens of thousands each day move past a reminder of what happened and of why the place they stand in is built the way it is. Colin Townsley is remembered by the London Fire Brigade as one of its own who gave his life. The empty space he left at Soho was honoured for years, and in 2021 a memorial plaque to him was unveiled, so that his name and his George Medal and his final act of going toward the trapped rather than away from the fire would not fade with the passing of the people who had known him. He went down into the smoke and stayed with a stranger who needed him. That is the whole of what a fire officer is, distilled into a single night. And then there was body 115. For 16 years, one of the 31 lay without a name. His body had been recovered, but no family had claimed him. No missing person report had matched, and the identification techniques of the late 1980s could take him no further than a number. The years passed. The station was rebuilt. The reforms took hold. And still he was body 115, an absence at the heart of the memorial, a man whom the fire had taken so completely that it seemed to have taken even his name. But he was not nameless. He had only been lost. As forensic science advanced, investigators returned to the case, determined that one of the King's Cross dead should not remain unknown forever. There was a detail to work with, a small and particular thing carried inside him. Years before, Alexander Fallon had undergone brain surgery, and a surgical clip of an unusual type had been placed in his skull, of a kind fitted to only a small number of men in the country. It was the sort of detail that matched against medical records and against the memories of a family that had never stopped wondering what had become of him, could finally close the gap. In January of 2004, 16 years after the fire, body 115 was identified. He was Alexander Williamson Fallon, born in Falkirk in 1914, husband of Janet, father of 4 daughters, 73 years old on the night he died. His name was added to the memorial, where the other 30 had been named all along. The last of the King's Cross dead had come home, in the only way that remained to him. There is a symmetry in the 2 men this story has carried. One went toward the fire and was remembered by name from the very first, honoured with a medal and a plaque and the keeping of an empty space. The other was taken by the fire and had no name at all for 16 years, a man who had drifted so far from everyone who loved him that even in death he could not at first be found. Between them they hold the whole of what a disaster is. It is the courage of the person who runs toward the danger, and it is the quiet, individual life of the person the danger destroys, each of them a human being and not a statistic, each of them owed the dignity of a name. 31 people went into King's Cross Station on the evening of the 18th of November, 1987, and did not come out. They were ordinary people on an ordinary Wednesday, and they died because an organisation had decided, over 30 years and 400 fires, that a danger it could not be bothered to see was not really there. It did not have to happen. That is the beginning and the end of it. A match, a bed of grease, a wooden staircase, a phenomenon no one had named, and a culture that had stopped being afraid. Everything that has been built since, every reform and every regulation and every metal stair is an answer written far too late to a question those 31 people should never have had to ask. The least we owe them is to remember that the safety we now take for granted was paid for in full by them. Consider more closely what the scientists actually did to solve the mystery of the flames, because it is one of the strangest pieces of detective work in the history of British fire investigation. When the inquiry's experts first tried to reconstruct the fire, they ran into a wall. The computer models they built, using the best understanding of fire dynamics available in 1988, kept predicting that the fire should have risen off the escalator in the ordinary way, a plume of flame and smoke going more or less straight up, spreading slowly. That was not what the survivors described. That was not what Police Constable Hanson had seen when the ball of flame crossed the ceiling of the ticket hall. The models and the reality disagreed, and when a model disagrees with reality, it is the model that is wrong. So the investigators did something unusual. They assumed provisionally that their computer results were correct and that every eyewitness was mistaken about the speed and the violence of what they had lived through, and then they built a physical model to check. At the research facilities of the Health and Safety Executive, engineers constructed a 1/3 scale replica of the King's Cross escalator, its trench, and the surrounding geometry, and they set controlled fires within it to see what would happen. What they saw astonished them. The flames did not rise. They lay down along the slope, exactly as the frightened passengers had said, clinging to the incline, reaching hungrily up the trench toward the top. The eyewitnesses had been right all along. It was the accepted science that had been wrong. Only then, working backwards from the physical experiment, did the modelers find their error and correct their computer simulations, until the mathematics finally reproduced what the scale model and the survivors had both shown. The flames flattened because the shape of the trench, the flow of air being drawn up the inclined channel, and the heating of the walls all combined to pull the fire down against the surface and drive it up the slope. It was a genuine discovery, arrived at by an act of humility, the willingness of scientists to trust the accounts of ordinary terrified people over the confident output of their own machines. That humility gave fire science one of its most important lessons of the 20th century. It is worth sitting for a moment with what that discovery meant for the people in the ticket hall, because the trench effect is not an abstraction. It is the reason there was so little warning. An ordinary escalator fire, rising slowly, would have filled the shaft with smoke and given people minutes, perhaps many minutes, to understand their danger and climb away from it. The trench effect stole those minutes. It took a fire that was still at 7:45, largely confined to one escalator, and it converted it in seconds into a wall of flame and smoke across the only space that everyone had to pass through to reach the street. The very act of evacuating people upward, the correct and humane instinct, funneled them toward the point where the trench effect was about to deliver its blow. Nobody directing that evacuation could have known. The knowledge that would have told them did not yet exist anywhere in the world. It was manufactured at terrible cost that night. And that returns the story to the choices that had left the escalator so ready to burn in the first place, because the trench effect only mattered because there was fuel for it. Here the detail from the inquiry becomes almost unbearable in its ordinariness. When investigators examined the running track beneath the wooden steps of escalator 4, they found the accumulation of grease and detritus that had gathered there over the decades of its working life. This was not a sudden failure. It was the slow product of a maintenance regime that cleaned what could be seen and left what could not. The tops of the escalators were kept presentable for the public. The hidden machinery beneath, where the danger actually lived, was another matter. Lubricating grease was applied to the moving parts and, over years, mixed with the dust and fibres and shredded paper and hair that sifted down through the gaps, forming a substance that was, in effect, a slow fuse waiting for a spark. The organisation had the means to know this was dangerous. 400 fires between 1958 and 1987 were 400 demonstrations of exactly this hazard, each one a small rehearsal for the disaster to come. Fennell's word for the collective failure to learn from them, the blind spot, is precise in a way that repays attention. A blind spot is not a place you choose not to look. It is a place you cannot see even when you are looking directly at it, because of the structure of your own vision. That was the tragedy of London Underground's safety culture. The information was there, the fires were logged, the reports were written, but the organisation had built for itself a way of seeing the world in which none of that information could register as a warning, because warnings were, by definition, about things that had not happened yet, and the Underground's guiding belief was that a fatal fire was a thing that did not happen. The rule about the fire brigade deserves to be understood in its full human meaning too, to instruct staff to call the London Fire Brigade only when a fire was beyond their control sounds, at first hearing, almost reasonable. Why summon professionals for something you can handle yourself? But turn it around, and its danger becomes plain. It meant that, at the moment a fire was first discovered, the correct procedure was not to raise the alarm with the people best equipped to fight it. The correct procedure was to attempt to deal with it in-house, and to wait. To wait until the fire had grown large enough, dangerous enough, uncontrollable enough to clear the high bar of being beyond control, by which time, of course, precious minutes had been lost, and the fire had been given exactly the head start it needed. The rule did not merely permit delay, it required it. It built hesitation into the reflexes of the entire organisation, at the one point in the sequence of a fire where hesitation is most expensive. On the night itself, that culture expressed itself in small, understandable, fatal human decisions. The water fog equipment fitted beneath the escalators was one of the sharpest examples. Somebody, at some point, had understood the danger well enough to install a system designed to put out precisely this kind of fire, precisely where it was most likely to start. The foresight was there in the hardware, but the follow-through was not there in the people. The staff on duty had not been trained to operate it, or had not been trained often enough or recently enough to reach for it with confidence in a moment of fear and confusion. And so the water fog system, the one piece of equipment purpose-built to drown the fire in the running track before it could ever reach the trench effect, was never turned on. It is one thing to lack a defence. It is another, and somehow worse, to have built the defence, installed it, and then failed to give anyone the knowledge to use it. The gap was not in the engineering, it was in the training, which is to say, in the value the organisation had placed on preparing its people for the danger it had decided would never come. The failures of communication ran through the whole evening. Staff radios were poor, and in an emergency that demanded rapid coordinated action across a large and confusing underground space, poor communication is not a minor inconvenience. It is the difference between a coordinated evacuation and a scattering of well-meaning individuals, each making the best guess they can with the fragment of the picture they can see. British Transport Police, London Underground staff, and the arriving fire brigade were all in those first minutes working with incomplete and imperfect information about what was happening, where the fire was, and where the people were. The written warning the London Fire Brigade had sent roughly a month earlier, the internal recommendations that had gone unheeded, the whole apparatus of knowledge that should have prepared this station for this night, had not translated into a single, trained, drilled, well-equipped response on the ground. That is what a safety culture is in the end. Not documents, not equipment sitting in a cupboard. It is what people actually do by trained reflex in the 10 minutes when it matters. And at King's Cross, those reflexes had never been built. There is one more dimension of the accountability that deserves to be drawn out, because it changed how Britain thinks about blame after a disaster. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for the inquiry to find a scapegoat among the frontline staff, to point to a member of station personnel who had not acted quickly enough, or a decision made in the fog of the emergency, and to hang the weight of 31 deaths upon it. That is what disasters often do to the people at the bottom. Fennell refused. He looked at the men and women who had been on duty that night, and he saw people who had been given no fire training worth the name, no evacuation drills, no working understanding of the equipment around them, no culture of vigilance to draw upon, and then had been confronted with a phenomenon that the finest fire scientists in the country could not at first explain. To blame them would have been not only unjust, but analytically false, because it would have located the failure in the last link of the chain, rather than in the many earlier links where the real decisions had been made. He placed the responsibility where the power had been, high up in the management and the systems of London Underground and London Regional Transport. And that principle that you follow the failure upward to where the authority to prevent it actually lay has shaped the investigation of British disasters ever since. The resignations of Sir Keith Bright and Dr. Tony Ridley have to be weighed honestly. No one went to prison. No family received the particular difficult closure that a criminal conviction can bring. For some of the bereaved, that absence of individual criminal accountability was, and remained, a source of deep frustration, a sense that 31 people had died and no one had been made to answer for it in a courtroom. And yet the departure of the two most senior figures in the organisation was not nothing. It was an acknowledgement at the highest level that the failure had been institutional and that the people who led the institution could not simply carry on as though the disaster had been an act of fate. In a culture that had told itself for decades that fatal fires did not happen, the removal of the men at the top was a way of saying, at last, that they did happen, that this one had, and that someone at the summit of the organisation had to own it. What happened at King's Cross did not happen in isolation, and to understand its full weight, you have to place it within the terrible run of years that surrounded it. Because Britain, in the late 1980s, was living through a sequence of disasters that would permanently change how the country thought about safety, negligence, and the ordinary citizen's right to come home alive. Less than a year before the fire, in March of 1987, the car ferry Herald of Free Enterprise had capsized outside the Belgian port of Zeebrugge, with the loss of 193 lives, having sailed with its bow doors open. In the years that bracketed King's Cross came the Piper Alpha oil platform explosion in the North Sea, the Clapham Junction rail crash, the Lockerbie bombing, the Hillsborough disaster. Again and again, in different industries and different settings, the same pattern revealed itself. Ordinary people going about ordinary business, and behind them, an organisation that had grown complacent, that had cut a corner, that had normalised a danger until the day the danger stopped being theoretical. King's Cross was one chapter in a national reckoning, and the lessons drawn from it fed into a wider transformation in how Britain understood the phrase corporate responsibility. The idea took hold, slowly and against resistance, that when an institution's failures kill people, the institution itself and the people who run it must answer, and that safety is not a cost to be minimised, but a duty that is owed. For the survivors and for the bereaved, the reforms and the inquiry findings were both everything and nothing. Everything, because they meant the deaths had changed the world, that no one else would have to climb a wooden escalator into a trench of accumulated grease, that the danger which had taken their people had been hunted down and eliminated. And nothing, because none of it brought anyone back. The roughly 100 people who were injured seriously enough to be taken to hospital carried the night with them for the rest of their lives, some with lasting physical injury, many more with the invisible weight of having been in that ticket hall when the flame crossed the ceiling. The firefighters who had worked in that heat, who had sprayed water onto one another's backs to buy a few more seconds, who had brought out the living, and then, through the small hours, confronted the dead, carried it too. Trauma of that kind does not resolve when an inquiry reports It settles into a life and stays there. And the families of the 30 gave the disaster its true measure, because behind each name on that eventual memorial was a household that did not get its person back on the evening of the 18th of November. Commuters who had left home that morning with the small unremarkable words that people exchange when they expect to see each other again in a few hours. A meal that would not be eaten, a chair that would stay empty. The particular cruelty of a commuter disaster is precisely its ordinariness. These were not people who had taken a risk, who had gone to war or to sea or down a mine. They had gone to work and tried to come home, and the machinery of their coming home had failed them. That is why the accountability mattered so fiercely to those left behind. It was not vengeance they were owed. It was the simple, immense acknowledgement that this should not have happened, that it had been allowed to happen, and that the allowing had a source. The long work of identifying the dead in the days after the fire was itself an act of care carried out under enormous strain, and it is a part of the story that is easy to pass over, but should not be. 30 of the 31 were named, one by one, matched to the missing person reports that flooded in as families across London and beyond realised that someone had not come home from King's Cross. Each identification closed one family's unbearable uncertainty and opened its grief, but the process could go only as far as the science and the records of 1987 would allow, and for one man it could go no further. There was no missing person report that fit. No one telephoned to say that a 73-year-old had failed to return, because the people who might have made that call did not know where he was, had not known for years, and had no reason to connect a father and grandfather who had slipped out of contact with a fire at a London Underground station. That silence, the absence of anyone searching, is the quietest and most piercing detail in the whole account. A disaster is normally defined by the frantic searching that surrounds it, the crowds at the police cordons, the telephone lines jammed with frightened relatives. For 30 of the dead, that searching happened. For the 31st, it did not because no one had ever loved him, but because the thread between him and the people who had loved him had been worn away year by year in the long grief that followed the death of his wife. He had 4 daughters. Somewhere in the country, they existed, going about their lives, not knowing that their father had been in the ticket hall at King's Cross, not knowing that the man the newspapers would come to call the mystery of the disaster was theirs. The tragedy of body 115 was not only that he could not be identified, it was that, for a long time, no one even knew to look for him among the dead. And so it is worth returning, at the last, to that single lit match, still warm, slipping through the side of a wooden escalator on a cold Wednesday evening. It was the smallest thing imaginable, an act so ordinary that 1,000 people might have done the same that week without consequence. It became a disaster only because of everything that lay beneath it, and around it, and above it, the grease that should have been cleared, the fire that should have been feared, the brigade that should have been called, the training that should have been given, the law that should have reached that far down into the ground. Every one of those was a choice, made by someone long before the match ever fell. That is the truth King's Cross leaves behind. Catastrophe is rarely a single monstrous event. More often it is a long accumulation of small permissions, of dangers renamed as routine, of warnings that arrive and are filed and forgotten, until an ordinary evening and an ordinary act tip the whole quiet arrangement into ruin. 31 people paid for that lesson so that the rest of us would never have to learn it the same way. You will not think of them the next time you ride an escalator down into the earth. There is no reason you should. The stairs are metal now. The sprinklers are hidden and ready. The air is clear. The signs are obeyed, and nothing about that smooth descent will tell you what it costs to make it safe. But it was them, a fire officer who went toward the danger and stayed with a stranger. A quiet man from Falkirk who waited 16 years to be given back his name. And 29 others who simply went to work and tried to come home on the 18th of November, 1987. Remember that the safety you never think about was written in the memory of people who deserved to be more than a warning. They were the price. The least we owe them is to know it.